Iran just struck Ben Gurion Airport. Not a radar dish in the desert, not a fuel depot on a military base. The airport, the one node that connects Israel to every ally, every supply line, every evacuation route, and every government that has been trying to maintain a physical presence in this conflict. Runways down, terminal hit, airspace closed over central Israel with no reopening timeline given. Flights that were minutes from landing have been rerouted to Amman, Larnaca, Athens, wherever the fuel held out. Israel is now physically severed from the world, and that is not a figure of speech. That is the operational reality as of this moment. And if you think that is just a logistical inconvenience, stay with me. Because what this strike actually means for Israel's ability to fight, sustain, and survive this conflict is something the Israeli government does not want its population to fully understand. Let me be direct about what Ben Gurion actually represented in the context of this war. Every serious military planner understands that a nation under sustained bombardment does not fight on courage alone. It fights on logistics. It fights on resupply. It fights on the uninterrupted flow of precision munitions, interceptor components, medical supplies, and dual-use equipment that keeps a military machine operational when its own domestic production cannot keep pace with expenditure rates. Ben Gurion was not simply Israel's largest civilian airport. In the functional reality of this conflict, it was the primary logistics artery through which the American resupply pipeline was flowing, not through dedicated military channels, but through civilian aviation infrastructure handling dual-use cargo on commercial and charter flights. That arrangement gave it political cover. It also made it irreplaceable. And Iran knew exactly what it was hitting. The interceptor components that Israel's domestic defense industry cannot manufacture fast enough to replace what is being expended. Those were arriving through Ben Gurion, the precision munitions that Israel's Air Force has been burning through against Iranian launch infrastructure, partially resupplied through Ben Gurion. The foreign nationals, the journalists, the humanitarian workers, the diplomatic personnel, the dual citizens who have been mentally holding on to that airport as their last exit option if conditions became unbearable, all of them were depending on Ben Gurion remaining open. One strike removed all of it simultaneously. That is not luck. That is the result of 4 weeks of deliberate Iranian intelligence collection on Israeli defensive coverage patterns, interceptor redistribution decisions, and the specific degradation of air defense density over the airport's perimeter. Iran did not strike blindly. It struck precisely at the moment when Israel's defensive envelope over that target had been worn down to the point where a calibrated strike package could get through, and what happens next changes the entire situation. Because the Israeli government's response to this strike is going to tell you everything about how much operational runway this government actually has left. Here is what the Israeli public was told. The airport was protected, it was defended, it was inside a defensive architecture that made a direct strike costly enough that Iran would not attempt it. Every one of those assurances has now been tested against reality and found to be either strategically incorrect or deliberately misleading. The Netanyahu Security Cabinet made a decision at some point in this conflict to concentrate remaining interceptor coverage over the Tel Aviv to Jerusalem corridor, the government and military infrastructure at the core of Israel's command structure. That was a rational military decision given interceptor attrition rates. But Ben Gurion sits at the southern edge of that corridor, not the center. And sitting at the edge of a priority coverage zone is not the same as being covered. The density differential between the core and the edge of that zone created a targeting opportunity that Iran's planners identified, tracked, and eventually exploited. The Israeli civilian population was not told that the coverage density over their primary international airport had degraded. They were told it was protected. Those are not the same statement. Stay with me, because the next phase is where things escalate well beyond what the headlines are capturing right now. The military logistics consequence of Ben Gurion going dark is not a problem Israel can solve quickly by routing resupply through Ramon Airport in the Negev. That calculation sounds straightforward until you examine what it actually produces. The moment Israel visibly redirects its critical logistics pipeline through Ramon, Ramon becomes the priority target. Iran has demonstrated tonight, with clarity that removes any remaining strategic ambiguity, that it possesses the range, the accuracy, and the residual launch capacity to strike civilian airport infrastructure inside Israel's current defensive envelope. Relocating the logistics node does not solve the vulnerability, it relocates it. And Iran does not need to be told which runway the next inbound American resupply flight is using. It has been watching Israeli logistics patterns since the first day of this conflict. The overflight problem compounds this further. Jordan has been managing its position in this conflict with the kind of careful neutrality that a country sandwiched between competing regional powers has to maintain if it wants to survive politically. The overflight permissions Jordan has been willing to grant for flights that are visibly military in character have been limited throughout this conflict for exactly that reason. Egypt has been operating under similar constraints. The American military resupply pipeline that partially ran through civilian channels at Ben Gurion does not have an alternative routing that operates at the same capacity, on the same timeline, with the same political cover that civilian aviation infrastructure provided. That pipeline has just been severed, and rebuilding it under current regional political conditions is not a matter of days. It is a matter of negotiations that take time Israel may not have. But if you think the logistics picture is the worst dimension of what happened this morning, it is only going to get worse when you look at what the Ben Gurion strike does to the evacuation situation that the Israeli government has been quietly managing since this conflict began. There are approximately 170,000 foreign nationals registered with their embassies inside Israel as of the start of this conflict. The ones who have not yet departed, whether by choice, by circumstance, or because their evacuation queue had not yet reached them, are now in a country with no functioning international airport and no government-issued timeline for when one will be available again. The embassies that were processing documentation, coordinating departure slots, managing the orderly movement of their citizens out of a conflict zone, every one of those processes ran through Ben Gurion. Those processes are now suspended. And the governments of those foreign nationals are now asking Washington and Jerusalem the same question simultaneously. How do you evacuate citizens from a country whose only international airport has just been struck by ballistic missiles and declared non-operational? The honest answer, the one that no government official will say publicly, is that you do not at scale, not with the urgency the situation demands, not without an airport. The Israeli government has not issued updated guidance to foreign nationals following the Ben Gurion strike. It has not told the foreign embassies in Tel Aviv what the restoration timeline looks like. It has not communicated to the international community whether the runway damage is repairable in hours, in days, or in a time frame that fundamentally changes the strategic calculus of every government maintaining a physical presence inside Israel. That silence is not an oversight. It is a pattern. The interceptor depletion was not disclosed publicly until the gaps became visible in strike footage. The Dimona damage assessment has not been released. The warhead composition of the nuclear-capable missile that struck Tel Aviv has not been confirmed. And now the Ben Gurion restoration timeline is being held back from the people who need it most. The civilians, the foreign nationals, the governments making real-time decisions about the safety of their citizens based on incomplete information that the Israeli government possesses and is choosing not to share. Every time this government has withheld operationally critical information, the people bearing the consequences have been the ones without access to it. That pattern has not changed this morning. It has only become more consequential. The economic dimension of what happened at Ben Gurion this morning is something that will not appear in the immediate tactical assessments, but will shape this conflict's trajectory in ways that outlast any single military exchange. Insurance markets do not assess risk in the abstract. They price it based on demonstrated outcomes. Ben Gurion being struck by Iranian ballistic missiles is not a risk assessment revision. It is a risk realization event. Every commercial airline that had maintained reduced service to Ben Gurion on the calculation that the airport's defensive architecture made a direct strike sufficiently unlikely to justify continued operations has just watched that calculation collapse in real time. The question of whether any major commercial carrier resumes service to Israel's primary international airport before this conflict ends is not a scheduling decision. It is a risk management decision. And after this morning, the answer from every airline's risk management department is almost certainly the same. A country that cannot receive commercial aviation cannot receive the full spectrum of dual-use supplies that civilian logistics networks move. It cannot maintain the international business and humanitarian presence that has been providing economic and diplomatic support throughout the conflict. And it cannot project to the watching world the image of a functioning state capable of sustaining a prolonged military campaign. What it projects instead is siege. Not siege in the medieval sense of armies surrounding walls. Strategic siege, the kind that does not require a single foreign soldier to cross a border, achieved entirely through the systematic removal of the infrastructure that connects a nation to the world it depends on. And what happens next in Washington may matter more than anything happening on the ground in Israel right now, because the American response to this strike is being shaped in real time by people who understand exactly what Ben Gurion represented to the resupply architecture they built around it. The White House is not asking whether to respond to the Ben Gurion strike. That question has already been answered. The question being worked through right now is how to respond to the closure of the primary node through which American military resupply has been flowing into this conflict, in a way that does not accelerate the regional escalation that American planners have been trying to manage since February 28th. That is not a simple problem. Every option that restores Israel's logistics capacity at sufficient scale and speed involves either direct American military logistics operations in a declared conflict zone or political negotiations with regional partners whose cooperation cannot be assumed under current conditions. Neither option is clean. Neither option is fast. And the window between now and when Israel's precision munition reserves reach levels that constrain operational tempo is not an open-ended timeline. Stay with me, because the domestic political dimension of this strike is where the full weight of what Iran accomplished this morning becomes impossible to separate from the question of how long this conflict continues. Every previous Iranian strike in this conflict hit infrastructure that most Israeli civilians could process at a distance. Military installations, radar arrays, nuclear research facilities in the Negev. These are things Israelis understand abstractly as important, but do not interact with personally. Even the Tel Aviv and Jerusalem strikes, devastating as they were in strategic and psychological terms, hit areas and systems that most Israelis could assign to a category of things that happened to others. Ben Gurion is categorically different. Every Israeli has passed through that airport. Every Israeli has a family member abroad they are now cut off from, or a family member in Israel who can no longer leave, or both. The airport is not an abstraction. It is the physical place where Israelis say goodbye to people they love and wait for people they love to return. Its closure is not a strategic data point that filters through news coverage and government briefings. It is a personal experience that every Israeli civilian is having simultaneously right now, regardless of their politics, regardless of their position on the conduct of this war, regardless of how much trust they have placed in the government that told them the airport was protected. That convergence of personal experience and government failure is the most dangerous political combination a wartime government can face. Netanyahu has demonstrated throughout his career an exceptional ability to manage crisis narratives, to reframe setbacks, to maintain public support through events that would have ended other governments. But the political architecture that has sustained his position through 5 uncontested strikes on Tel Aviv, 2 strikes on Jerusalem, a dual-city strike on both simultaneously, 2 strikes on Dimona, and a nuclear-capable missile over Israel's largest city. That architecture was built on the premise that the core civilian infrastructure Israelis depend on personally remained intact. Ben Gurion was the last major piece of that premise. It is gone this morning. And the Israeli public that wakes up to a closed airport, to stranded family members, to a government that has no restoration timeline to offer, is not the same public that has been absorbing military infrastructure strikes at a distance. It is a public experiencing the war directly, personally, in the place that represented their last connection to the world beyond the conflict. The political sustainability of a government that assured its population that connection was protected is now the open question that this conflict cannot defer. Iran has now demonstrated a targeting progression that any serious military analyst has to assess not as a series of independent strikes, but as a systematic campaign against every category of infrastructure that sustains Israel's ability to fight and function. It struck military installations. It struck government centers. It struck nuclear research infrastructure. It put a missile into Tel Aviv that required a public non-confirmation of its warhead composition, and now it has closed the airport. Each strike in that sequence was more strategically consequential than the one before it. Each one removed a capability or a confidence that Israel's government and population had been depending on. The question that follows from that progression is not complicated, but it is the question that every government watching this conflict is now being forced to answer for themselves. If Iran has worked systematically through military targets, government targets, nuclear targets, and now civilian logistics infrastructure, and if Ben Gurion is not the last entry on that list, what comes next? And does Israel have the defensive capacity remaining to stop it? That is the question this morning's strike has placed at the center of this conflict. And the answer based on the trajectory of the last 4 weeks is not one that the Netanyahu government is prepared to give honestly to the people who need to hear it most.